Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here today and to share with you some information that has long been hidden, and it will come to light a little today, hopefully. We're going to talk about an artist, a Texas artist, who is considered the oldest artist, living artist, was the oldest living artist at his death in 2004, African-American artist here in Dallas, Texas. His name is James Charles Thibodeaux. Now, Thibodeaux was not born here in the Dallas, Texas. James Charles Thibodeaux, African-American artist, photographer, actor, and historian, was born July 21st, 1911, in the parish county of St. Martinsville, Louisiana. Thibodeaux was the firstborn of 4 children of Ernest Charles Thibodeaux Sr. and Fannie E. Young Thibodeaux. Fannie Thibodeaux died at an early age, and in 1920, Ernest Thibodeaux Sr. moved his children to Dallas, Texas from Louisiana. James' father was a graduate of Straight University, which later became Dillard University in New Orleans. And in 1920, he moved his family, as I stated earlier, to Dallas, Texas, and at that time, he gained employment with the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. He was, in this image here, the gentleman to the left there, and the picture left, the grouping there, the gentleman to your left, on the extreme left side there, is Thibodeaux Sr. And they moved to Dallas, and they lived in this wonderful neighborhood called North Dallas. And that is the map of North Dallas at that time. North Dallas was on the edge of the city there, and it was a thriving neighborhood consisting of all kinds of exciting things there for African Americans. It was the first real serious black community here in Dallas, and they lived on Thomas Avenue here in Dallas at that time. Now, there were 2 schools here in Dallas for blacks at that time, public schools. That was B.F. Durrell School, located on Hall Street, and there was also, that was the elementary school, and then the Booker T. Washington High School, which was located on Flores Street, which is now in the center of the Arts District, downtown Dallas. That was that entire new Arts District here in Dallas is a part of the old North Dallas neighborhood for African Americans at that time. That was a thriving neighborhood, and all the black intellectuals lived there, the professional people lived there. It was a self-contained community that was there at that time. Now, there was also a Catholic school in that community, and Thibodeaux Sr. decided that his son will attend the Catholic school. All of his kids went to the Catholic school, and it was called St. Peter's. It was founded by an order of nuns out of San Antonio, Texas, and those nuns instituted that school. It was called the Sisters Institute originally there. At that school, the picture in the middle there, the image in the middle is Sister Michael. She was the mentor of James Thibodeaux at St. Peter's Academy there at the time that he was attending St. Peter's Academy. At the academy, she mentored him with his art skills and the like there. she encouraged him to go on to New York to study. Why New York, and why did he not stay in Texas? Because he was unable to get into any of the local universities and all around in this area due to discrimination during that time. And in New York, he settled in at the Harlem YMCA. The YMCA was very important to African Americans during this period of time in the 30s because it was served as a hotel and a traveling accommodations for men and women alike at that time to have decent housing when they traveled to major cities around the United States. He settled in there, and then he got a job with WOR, which was a radio station there, and has now been converted to a TV station as well. And there, while in New York, he befriended a wonderful woman by the name of Augusta Savage. Augusta Savage, who was the first African-American female to be elected into the American National Association of Women Painters and Sculptors. Savage founded and operated the Savage Studio of Arts and Crafts in Harlem. It was at Savage Studio that Thibodeaux met Bernie Hayes Robinson, who was considered by his peers the dean of Black graphic arts and pioneered serigraphic printmaking. And Bernie became Thibodeaux's mentor at that time. But it was Miss Savage, the artist, who suggested that Thibodeaux apply for enrollment at Cooper Union. He applied to Cooper Union there in New York, and he received a scholarship. He was accepted and he received a scholarship, full tuition. But there was some glitch at the time that he was able to go there. It was the graduate students were so many at that time that they did not have space. So 3 of the people in his class were moved over to what is known as the Mechanics Institute, where he then studied there and received his diploma in freelance drawing from the General Society of the Mechanics. And this is an image of that diploma or his membership to that organization. Now, while in New York in 1943, Thibodeaux was still working at WOR, the radio station at that time. He was drafted into the military, and he received a very interesting position there in the military. He served as the Army's first artistic instructor in the special services for the military during that time. That's how he did his military service. With the exception of that military service, he worked at WOR for 47 years and retired in 1977 as a television operations supervisor. Thibodeaux's day job at WOR was dealing with coordinating, directing, and producing television programs that afforded him many opportunities to meet national and international performers and visual artists and celebrities, such as you see in the middle photo there is, that's Joe Louis with Ruth Brown. And the other photograph is Miss Roosevelt with Mrs. Ashford, who is a prominent Dallas person here, who was an educator as well, and when she came to Dallas, Texas. And I should also mention that his photographs were also included in Sepia magazine. Most of his photographs were published in Sepia magazine, which was a magazine that was published in Fort Worth, Texas during this period of time. And it's interesting that that entire collection now of the photographs of the Sepia collection belongs to the African American Museum collection here in Dallas at this time. So if anyone is interested in those photographs, you can get those at the African American Museum. Interestingly enough, throughout his employment with the WRA, he pursued his career in art. And here you see sketches that he did of the Metropolitan Opera there. And that's a poor image over to the right, but it's the only one that I could find, but it's very significant. Those images are all sketches of Porsha Washington Pittman. Who is Porsha Washington Pittman? She lived here in Dallas, Texas as well. She was the daughter of Booker T. Washington. She was married to the architect here in Dallas, black architect by the name of Sidney Joseph Pittman. The St. Paul United Methodist Church there in the Arts District today, across the street from the Booker T. Washington High School that is still standing there today, is the work of her husband, the architect Sidney Joseph Pittman as well. Those sketches on that side there are of Porsha Washington Pittman. Here's some examples of some of the work that he was doing at that time, and I must mention that what he was doing is documenting through visual art African American life and culture. He was taking his lead from the Harlem Renaissance and Alain Locke, the philosopher from Howard University, who instructed African Americans at that time during that movement to return to their roots, their culture, instead of imitating general American life and culture with landscapes and reproducing mainstream art. So what they were doing was documenting various aspects of their own culture. For example, on the right, the portrait of the young man there in charcoal there is of Dr. John Leslie Patton. He was the first African-American principal of the Booker T. Washington High School here in Dallas. And I must mention, this is very important. Why am I talking about Pittman being in Thibodeaux being in New York, and we're talking about Texas artists and him living and working in New York. Dr. Patton, like most of our educators during this period of segregation in Texas, were unable to get graduate degrees in the state of Texas at the university level. So they had to go out of state, and most of them went to north to Columbia University and NYU to receive their degrees. And it was there in New York that Thibodeaux did this portrait of Dr. Patton. But he knew Patton and his roots, and it kept him connected with Dallas. And he was the stream to take information back to the arts and cultural community back into Texas while living in New York. There's another example here of that is the gentleman down here, the priest, Father Maxwell Murphy. He was also a graduate of St. Peter's Academy here in Dallas. The portrait there in oil by Thibodeaux. He was unable to serve in the United States or even be ordained as a Catholic priest here, and he received his ordination in Prague, in Europe, and the like. And he served as a priest in South America after that point. But he is also a Dallas native as well, and a product of St. Peter's Academy. And the portrait is done by Pittman. You notice the missal and the still life there and the like. Thibodeaux was an ardent Catholic, very serious Catholic, and he did a lot for the Catholic Church as well. And the other piece up in the upper left-hand corner there is an example of his printmaking that he was doing under the tutelage or mentorship of Mr. Robinson, Bernie Hayes Robinson. Now, interestingly enough, in New York, he did exhibit a lot. He exhibited at the Eva Jesse Studio, the County Cullen Library, the Harlem branch of the New York Library, the Tom Fielding Studio and Gallery, and he also participated in a group show in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But interestingly enough, are these images familiar to you? Have you seen these buildings before? This building. It looks familiar, yes. This is in Fair Park, but the building that you see there in the middle is the Hall of Negro Life and Culture. It was built for the Texas Centennial, and that building no longer exists. After the Centennial was over, the building was demolished. This is a good case at hand to express that racism was still rampant in Texas at that time. The reason it was demolished as it goes is because it would allow Negroes at that time admission into the park on a daily basis after the fair, the Centennial, was over. And the excuse for demolishing that building was that the music hall needed a larger parking lot because it was right across from the music hall there that was converted there. That was the Ford Exhibition Hall was converted into the music hall, and then they needed a larger parking lot for that. And so that's why it was demolished at that time. But I'm showing this because Thibodeaux exhibited at this particular institution at that time. And I'd like to note also for us proud Texans that this was the first building constructed to acknowledge the contributions of African Americans culturally anywhere in the United States when this building was created, erected for that particular event. Thibodeaux also worked with children, as you see there in Harlem, and various organizations there. And this is one of the projects I'm showing there, that image there, of an illustration that he did of how he was teaching them design and the like. This is a Spool Tractor where he was teaching them that you can use everyday objects to just ordinary things, found objects and all, to be creative and make things. This is called a Spool Tractor, which is made from a sewing machine spool, thread spool, with a rubber band and some dowels on each side of it. And you see the candle there to the right, upper right corner there. It just takes the wax from that to put on each side, the top and bottom of the spool pieces there, and run the rubber band through it, put a piece of the dowel at one end to lock it in place, and you use the other end, the longer end, here to crank it up. And that will make it roll, just like a steamroller or a tractor. It would roll. So he would make these type of toys and things like that for the kids as a designer and all. But he would do these things with the young people and encourage them to use their creativity and the like. You know, Thibodeaux was fortunate to study and work in New York at a time considered revolutionary for African Americans in the United States. And these African Americans at that time seized the opportunity to promote political, economic, and social agendas that would benefit black communities nationally. Organizations like the National Advancement for the Advancement of Colored People and the National Urban League were instrumental in promoting a cultural revitalization movement in cities nationally. And that movement became known as the Negro Renaissance, which a lot of people refer to as the Harlem Renaissance. But it was the Negro Renaissance because this was appearing in cities all across the United States. But Harlem was considered the capital of the Negro Renaissance during that period. Literally, Dallas had its own Renaissance during that time as well. That was happening down in Deep Ellum, but we call today and all, the music industry was thriving here as well. Literature, theater, visual arts, and music became vehicles to enhance the reputation of self-esteem of African Americans. Thibodeaux embraced the movement and made powerful friends who helped him cultivate a serious career. Along with drawings, paintings, and documenting aspects of African American life and culture, this is interesting here. Thibodeaux also played as an actor in the theater as well. This is a scene. Here's the person on the extreme right over there, on this image there to the extreme right, your extreme right, of him in a play called No Count Boy, which was performed in Dallas, and it was performed by a theater group which was the first African American group here in Dallas known as the Dallas Negro Players. And it was so successful that it went on to play in New York, and he played in the same role in New York at the Harlem Experimental Play, with the Harlem Experimental Players. In the early 1980s, Thibodeaux moved back to Dallas permanently. He lived in a modest wood-framed house on Oakland Avenue. And Oakland Avenue is now known as Malcolm X Boulevard here in Dallas. And it's in a section of South Dallas, which was called Queen City at that time. And this house was owned by his father at that time, and he had this house to move back to return to Texas. When he returned to Texas, he married a young artist by the name of Loretta Pipkins. She was 28 years his junior. Yes, interesting. Yeah, I know. And for almost a quarter of a century, the Thibodeauxs continued to draw, paint, and document aspects of African American life here in Dallas. And at the same time, he was mentoring many, many artists who came to flock at his door here locally. And while he was doing that here, he also volunteered as a resource specialist at what you see here, the Experience of a Lifetime project. As he worked there as a volunteer, as a resource specialist. and at the African American Center for History and Culture, which was located in the Nolan Estes public school system here with the DISD. It was an education program designed to engage primarily young minority students in culture rather than just show them artifacts in a passive manner. So what Thibodeaux would do there with this is to tell the students what his life was like when he was growing up and how it fits into a historic development of a culture. The center was located in the Nolan Estes Education Plaza, and it was a unique Dallas public school complex. It was a learning experience for the kids there, here in Dallas. During this period of his life, Thibodeaux exhibited with the Dallas Public Artists Guild and at the Martin Luther King Community Center. And in 1991, he was honored by the Dallas Living Legend, by the Dallas Black Academy of Arts and Letters. The image that you see here on this project and this program was designed by Thibodeaux, the illustration there. Now, I'd like to mention that this time period that Thibodeaux was in New York was a crucial time. The things that he learned and the people that he became involved with, like Langston Hughes, and the artists and the writers there during that time, was a pivotal thing for him to connect to Dallas. He was constantly in connection with Dallas and Texas artists to make sure that they were in the loop of what was progressing and how to use their aesthetics. And then on June the 9th, unfortunately, in 2004, James and Loretta Thibodeaux were divorced. And 1 month and 22 days later, on August the 10th, James Charles Thibodeaux, at the age of 93, the oldest living African-American artist in Dallas, died. It was a tragic ending. His wife sent him after the divorce, sent him to New Orleans, where he did have some distant relatives, and he died there. And then they sent him back to Dallas for a funeral mass here in Dallas, Texas, and all. And the arts community and people from all over the United States, African American artists, came to Dallas for that ceremony at that time. It's very important to understand the contributions of Mr. Thibodeaux as an artist and his contribution to Texas as an artist, because his influence has guided most African American artists, and particularly those artists who became art teachers in the school system here in Dallas, because that was their day job, and they were declared invisible. There was very little places for them to show their work and the like, and Thibodeaux was considered the dean because he led the path to how they could get their work published and get things taken care of as professional artists. Are there any questions at this time?
What happened to the content of the Negro Culture Hall in Fair Park after it was
Very good question. What happened, the collection, it was not, they were all on loan, so they went back to the lenders at that time. It was very interesting, that whole situation there, how that all came about. First of all, to even get the Hall of State there for, you know, African American life and culture, it was, we have a building named after the gentleman, what is his name? He was, I'm having one of those senior moments, but there is a building here in Dallas, a federal building named after him now. He was the, thank you very much. That's the name, A. Maceo Smith was the head of the Negro Chamber of Commerce at that time. And when the centennial was supposed to be here in Dallas, and Dallas was bidding for it and the like, and won the bid to have it here in Dallas, A. Maceo Smith went to City Hall, to the council, and said, well, listen, the African American community would like to also participate in the centennial. What can we do, you know, to participate? City Council said, wonderful idea. There's one problem we have here. We don't have money in the budget for this. So A. Maceo Smith did not give up at that point. He went down to Austin, to the state government, and asked for funding to build, so we could contribute, the African American community could contribute. The same reply there was no funding available. So he still did not give up. He went to the State Department in Washington, D.C., and the State Department granted the Dallas Negro Chamber of Commerce a $50,000 grant, which built that building. It was built by the State Department. And if you notice, the interesting thing about that story is it was built at that time and all, and as I said previously, it was demolished after the fair to remove blacks from the park after the fair was over due to discrimination, and then the blacks were only allowed in the parks once a year, and that was called Negro Achievement Day. And we could go to the fair during those days. Now, the interesting thing about that is in the 1980s, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Harry Robinson Jr. comes to Texas from Louisiana also, and was at Bishop College. And what he did was he decided that Dallas needed an African American museum. And he eventually, well, we see the museum is here today. But the interesting thing about it, when we were trying to find a location for this institution, it became apparent to Harry, knowing the history, Dr. Robinson knowing the history of what had happened to the Hall of Negro Life and Culture, that it was, he wanted to have that same property in Fair Park. So he suggested that it be built there, unknowing to a lot of Dallas citizens that that was there at one time, the Hall of Negro Life and Culture. So it was granted that property, so the new museum there, the African American Museum in Fair Park now, we consider the phoenix from the ashes. It's built on the grounds of the Negro life and culture there. Now, the interesting thing about that story there is this back and forth with them demolishing, and as I said, they put up a swimming pool. There was a big swimming pool there at Fair Park at one time, public swimming pool. And that swimming pool was at that location also. You had the parking lot, and then you had the swimming pool. Well, I have this backwards up. You had the swimming pool first. They put a swimming pool there. And then it was a public pool, of course, and blacks could not participate in swimming. They could not go swimming there. Integration comes to Dallas. Oh, we have a problem with the swimming pool. From the swimming pool, that's when we expand the parking lot for the music hall. We no longer need a swimming pool. We need a parking lot here. Expand the parking lot. So we cover the swimming pool and expand the parking lot for the music hall. Okay? You following me? The African American Museum eventually gets that portion of the land back to build the African American Museum. We receive a sculpture piece from George Smith, a donation, a professor of sculpture, African American sculptor from Rice University, to grace the building there. I come on board to the African American Museum, and one of my first charges was to identify the location for the erection of this sculpture on the grounds of the African American Museum. The sculpture, let me explain this, is called Nomo. You've probably noticed it. You've seen it, but you didn't see it because it's one of these abstract pieces that can go unnoticed, but it's a strong, powerful column. It leans forward. Nomo is the god of water. Okay? And Nomo, you see where this story is going? Nomo is the god of water. He is out of the one of the African deities, and it's due to an agricultural society. And so Nomo is preyed upon that it rains so that the crops will grow and flourish. Now, Nomo, in a wooden sculpture piece for African deity, is pictured leaning forward with his hands up like this. And he's leaning forward. George Smith, the sculptor, takes that concept and he makes just a straightforward, I guess you would say, not column because it's squared off, with two knobs on the top. Very abstract, very abstract. You could say it's a long rectangle with two knobs, squares on the top, representing the hands of Nomo. The place, the position and location of the piece is facing the entrance, court entrance to the museum off the parking lot, okay? That's where we selected to place it. Well, when we started the construction and preparing to install this piece there, we had to dig deep into to install this piece. And lo and behold, we hit the swimming pool. So The standing joke at the African American Museum is Nomo is ascending from the god of water, is now ascending from the swimming pool at the African American Museum. So, that's, yes?
So after hearing your talk, I might know the answer to this, but could you touch on what it was like for you in Dallas when you were going through your formal education and you found your way to Berlin because of some of the comments you made?
That's interesting. And before I do that, well, I did say that earlier about African Americans getting graduate degrees and things like that to move forward. And what was interesting about that, it meant that prior to desegregation, African Americans during my generation had some of the best teachers, African American teachers, that you could get anywhere here in Texas, because they were all very well educated. They had master's and PhD degrees, all of them, and they were from East Coast schools and all, because they could not, participate here. Now, for me, it was a segregated society that I grew up in through high school. Booker T. Washington High School at that time, by the way, was a technical high school, but it had an academic program. I was in the academic program there, but it had a technical aspect to it as well. They taught wood shop. They had even had cosmetology there. They had mechanical and architectural and engineering drawings was taking place there and the like, and they had wood shops there as well. And then they had the academic program, which I was a part of that. The impact of that on my life at that time, we just took for granted because we didn't know any difference about the difference between going to white institutions or public institutions and the like. But fortunately enough, I came from a background and a family that I was able to travel a lot prior to that and all. And then my father was from Howard University also. And so I went to Howard University. And it was at Howard University, well, prior to that, let me back up again. As a student here in Dallas at that time, high school student, I was selected as one of 30 Americans to travel as junior ambassadors to Europe at the age of 17. And there were only three African Americans selected from around the United States to do that. And fortunately enough, two of them were from Dallas. Clarence Jones, yes, myself, and a young lady by the name of Pamela Weiser, or something like that, out of Philadelphia. And we traveled to Europe at that time. And I was impressed by what I experienced during that period, that I knew after school that I would go back to Europe and the like. And in Washington, D.C., when I was at Howard University, I had the privilege of having Dr. Elfinger, who was an art instructor at the old Humboldt University in Berlin before, World War II, who was a Jew from Canada that immigrated to the United States. He was my mentor there in Washington, D.C. And he guided me to get back to Berlin, to study in Berlin. That's how I got to Berlin. Okay, and I studied at the Hochschule für Bildende Kunst and the Freie Universität there to do my postgraduate work there. Then to go on and worked at the British School of Brussels in Belgium. Okay? Yes?
Phillip, is there any published documentation on the activities that went on in the Negro Hall of Fame at Fair Park?
Yes. There at the African American Museum, you can get the list of the artists who participated, the names of the paintings and all, but it's very difficult tracking those images today. Very, very difficult to get those. Because they're in private collections and the like.
But it included the work of Texas artists? The exhibition there included Texas artists?
Well, I just learned here a few minutes ago from a gentleman. Was it you? There he is. There. Samuel Conti was one of the Texas artists, African American artists.
But as far as you know, that's the only Texan that you know the name of? The reason I'm asking.
Well, it might be on that list if I go down that list. I beg your pardon?
That tells where they're from?
Yeah, it will tell you, because there's a small biography of each one of them on that list.
Someone was in Houston, were trying to do research on a group that was active in the 30s in Houston called the Negro Art Guild. But there's almost no documentation, even Elliott Wardlaw at TSU had never heard of it. And so how do you find out about Dallas in the 30s? Maybe we can use the same technique in Houston.
This is not an easy task because these documents and things were not archived during that time of African. It wasn't considered of no value. It's very hard finding these documents. You can only get them through family papers or obituaries. It's very difficult to get that information. Yes?
To Mr. Thibodeaux's estate, as you were talking, I was so worried. He's elderly, his younger wife was divorced, and he's shipped.
Yes.
And I imagine an
Very
act of
interesting
that.
question. That's a very interesting question. Fortunately, fortunate and unfortunate. There's two things going on here. The papers and documents are primarily at the Briscoe Center at the University of Texas, and the photographs, they're there. Now the artwork, that's why you're not seeing very much of any of things that he did here, that disappeared with the wife.
But she must still be alive.
Yes. The last we know of her, she's in Houston, Texas somewhere. Yeah. She is a ceramist and textile artist. Her name is Loretta Pipkin.
Did you spell that?
Pipkin.
Nobody's excused till we all get there.
Exchange for access to his work.
Yeah. So that's the last was heard of her. I mean, she did not even attend the funeral. She was not here.
The four images that you showed, the one with the Jesuit with the cross, that was Loretta Pipkin's work. She was also an artist?
No.
No, they were all of his.
That's all his work, yes. And documentation of his work, yes.
When you said that Thibodeaux was instrumental in, he kept contact with the people in Dallas, did he help, struggling artists or people who wanted to become artists go to New York and train?
That's it. He would.
You have names of these artists go on to become famous or have important?
Well, they're not famous nationally, but they're known within the arts, African American arts community. Most of them are known doing, but they're not names that you would probably recognize. Like I had to think about which artist to present in this situation, inasmuch as he was the oldest and mostly like the father to all of these artists. For example, there's a gentleman named Foxhall, Horace Foxhall. Anybody familiar with that name? Beautiful work, beautiful, beautiful artwork. But he taught in the Dallas public school.
He returned to Dallas?
Yes, here in Dallas. But he studied there, and he was meant to also, he was in New York also for a while as well.
How do you spell his surname?
Foxhall, Foxhall. And in fact, I'm putting together a Foxhall exhibition. The museum has come into a cache of his exhibit of his works. He's a sculptor and painter.
When will that exhibition be? You know?
When I get it done. Remember, I'm retired. Yes.
So did Thibodeaux have any dealings with the pioneer black professor in Houston, John Biggers? Do you know?
John Biggers was a friend of his as well, yes. John Biggers came to him as well. And the other gentleman, there's another gentleman there in Houston that people don't talk too much about, who is underserved, Carol Harris Sims. Underserved. Very good artist.
One last question.
It's really hard to find his work, though.
It's hard to find any
It may not be sound. What can we read to find out about African American art history in Texas? Is there anything in print?
Not collectively like that. It's in bits and pieces, just like, you know, I'm on the search, but you know these names and all, and it gives you spurs, and you go here, and then.
So are you coming out of retirement to write that history?
Well, you know, it's interesting that you say that, because when I started working on this, I thought something needs to be done about this. Yeah. Something, yeah.
Was there, just one more thing, was there any gallery representation for any of these artists in this area, or was it strictly in New York and the Northeast?
No. Most of the places that these artists showed would be in the black YMCA or the black churches, the public schools. But we were declared, you know, invisible. It had no value at that time. Okay? Thank you.